Why do we play Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games? Why do we struggle to balance our precious improvised stories with complicated game rules and the mismatched schedules of our everyday lives? Because when we create adventures together, we are capable of experiencing something more personal and more meaningful than whatever's on streaming this week. I believe that we can capture lightning in a bottle to make truly magical moments. We can manufacture lightning in a bottle. We can't, without cheating anyway, guarantee a perfect roll of the dice. However, we can set the odds in our favor. If we know the steps, we can see the path to magical moments with the gift of Truesight. I am inviting you to think about the way we think about RPGs. For some of you that have never played a tabletop role-playing game and might be thinking about it because of the new movie or an old episode of that TV show you like, I hope I can give you a glimpse into this world and why it matters to so many people. For those of you who have been playing for years, I hope this will help you consider how you view the game and hopefully change the way you approach your stories and encounters next time you are in the Game Master chair. This story happens to be about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but I think its concepts will apply to plenty of other games. As we dive into the realm of thought, let's tell a story. This is my absolute favorite magical D&D moment, and it didn't all happen at once. Our story begins with a burly and surly half-orc named Ton. Ton was definitely not the knight in shining armor type. He was a mercenary who was getting a little too tired of the sellsword life and wanted to make a better name for himself. He accepted a call to arms to slay a young dragon, eventually slayed that dragon with the help of a ragtag found family, and now that found family needs to hit the town for some shopping and training. Ton meets an old man who runs a gym training prize fighters. At one point, this old man might have been one of these fighters, but now he just rings the bell. Ton really hits it off with this guy. His name is Ranunculus, an aging Goliath gladiator who sees something special in Ton. None of the other pit fighters and adventurers passing through his gym have the combination of Ton's drive, Ton's strength, and Ton's struggle to do good with his violence. While the rest of the party scatters away to do research and trading in other parts of the town, Ton dedicates his time to training with Ranunculus. Ton has a mind to buy the old man's giant flail, a meteor hammer, but he sees that the old man is selling away his gym and decides it's better that the old man hold on to his old Goliath weapon, even if his weathered muscles can no longer swing it like they used to. "Maybe," Ton grumbles sometime later on the trail, "Ranunculus still has a fight or two left in him. I won't be the guy to take that away from him." Everything I just told you is happening where roleplayers call in-game. Ton is a character in a game, and that game is set in a world being constantly improvised by the efforts of myself, the players, and the roll of the dice. A lot of people have pointed out the difference between the game elements and the story elements, simplified to roleplay versus roleplay. The TTRPG or even LARP experience exists in the intersection of these two circles. Except that I think that's neither accurate nor helpful because it is a false dichotomy, so I'm gonna make both of these things, the game and the story, one circle. You cannot have one without the other. If your game has no story, it exists as numbers in a notebook. If your story has no roles, you are participating in a free-form shared imagination space, which, while admittedly is a cool activity for kids or adults to share in, it is not a role-playing game like Dungeons & Dragons. When you roll the die and do some math, you get a number. That number, compared to my number, determines that your character's sword pierces through my monster's scaly hide, and in that moment, we have created a reality that exists in the story we are now telling together. But the outcome would not have happened without the dice simulating fate to tell us the result of our planning. So, We are going to make a circle for the game, and understand that the game consists of both the narrative and the rules intertwining to create the experience of a TTRPG. Ton and Ranunculus exist inside this circle. The players and I, the Dungeon Master, impact this circle to make the reality that forms the game world. By understanding this circle and the reality within, if Ton would actually like to rob Ranunculus and steal his meteor hammer, that will happen in the game as long as he can make the appropriate stealth and sleight of hand numbers by rolling a 20-sided die and adding his dexterity. Understanding the relationship between game mechanics and decision making helps you begin to see the role-playing game experience. But it is not the full picture, and this story isn't over. Ton, a half-orc paladin of vengeance with the soldier background, is the character being played by Greg. Greg is a pretty cool guy. I'm playing Ranunculus and all the non-player characters and enemies that the players come across. I noticed that Ton has a connection with Ranunculus, and I noticed that Greg has a connection to the non-player character I introduced. Ranunculus was never intended to be more than a two-note townie NPC, but when I see an opportunity to make a story personal for my players, I take note and attempt, at least, to follow through. While the Fulcrum, that's the name of the party, are out on their next quest, retired Ranunculus remembers Ton. He begins hearing the great deeds of the Fulcrum, and something softens his gruff, tough guy demeanor. Is he inspired by this young man that reminded him of his younger self? Or is he jealous of this young man's glory? Does he, as Ton said, have a chance for one more adventure before old age takes him? That is when Ranunculus gets an offer. One of the dragon gods is assembling an all-star team of adventurers to solve the greatest blight upon the realm, and that team needs a strong man. Ranunculus has his doubts that he can live up to his prime, but the dragon god gives him a belt of stone giant strength. This will return him back to his former glory, and Ranunculus accepts the offer. When the Fulcrum gains access to the scrying spell, Ton witnesses through the magical looking glass what Ranunculus has become. The old man is now a force of nature, taking down giants with his wrecking ball of a weapon, receiving the adoration of the masses that never would have cheered for or even noticed a washed-up has-been. When the Fulcrum uncovers the clues of the vile plots of the realm, they become certain that the dragon god Altor is their enemy. And that means that they will have to fight Altor's team of hired swords. When this dawns upon Ton, he grits his tusks and looks off in the distance, towards some future battlefield beyond the dozens he has survived. Everyone, when we find Altor and his goons, leave the old Goliath to me. That fight is mine alone. Excellent, I think, out of game. All according to a dungeon master's plan. Now, Greg is a great player. He was old school, but knew the rules. He stayed out of the spotlight until a group needed a leader, and then he would step up. And while it's fitting with Ton's character to step up and utter a stalwart call to action when everyone else is bickering, this is also a decision made by Greg, because Greg knows the story must progress so that the party can raid the next dungeon and get the next level up. This is not thinking strictly in-game terms. We are now in the realm of the metagame. That weapons training happened during downtime, which Ton needed to master the dire flail he had found as an exotic weapon he could wield one-handed with a shield, or rather, so that he could write down a dire flail and a shield on his character sheet, because the game balance of player characters dictates that one cannot normally wield a protective shield and a big-ass anime buster sword at the same time. it might be reasonable in the game world for Ton to do this. Ton is a jacked half-orc, almost 7 feet tall, with metal grafted onto his muscles. He can do things a human man cannot do, and we can make it real. But the game needs balance so that every player doesn't just get to play Playground Warriors and say, oh yeah, well, my wizard can do that too, and also I have heat vision. You heard me refer to Ranunculus as an NPC. Yes, he's a character in our story, a piece on our game board, but Greg and I both know that he is an obstacle written into the adventure by me. Ranunculus is not real. This story is not real. This is not a pipe. You've heard the story of Ranunculus and Ton, but you can't play their characters unless I told you the exact keywords and numbers that form up their character sheets. What your character does with those sheets is the game, but your decisions of what to put on that sheet of paper based on watching 10 hours of optimization videos this week and your personal feelings and game theory are the meta game. The dice rolling, simulating fate are the game, but the ways we apply bonuses and put ourselves in advantageous circumstances in order to satisfy specific rules are the metagame. Remember when I mentioned that Ton could rob Ranunculus by rolling a stealth and sleight of hand check using his dexterity? Well, a few folks watching would tell us that, well, actually, Ton could and should roll a strength skill like athletics, since an armored paladin would be most likely to have a higher strength score than dexterity. That's metagaming. But it also blends with the game, because within the game world, it makes perfect sense that Ton, the strong but not very swift, would try to brute force a weapon away from an old man rather than try to underhandedly steal it. But that's not all. We are also in a bit of a meta-narrative. Remember when I told you the first section on the second main idea after the thesis of this video essay I wrote a script for? I said some things like great deeds, gruff, tough guy demeanor, one more adventure before old age takes him, all-star team, solve the greatest blight upon the realm, strong man, doubts that he can live up to his prime, adoration of the masses, team of hired swords, grits his tusks and looks off in the distance towards some future battlefield beyond the dozens he has survived. That fight is mine alone. Without going into detail, I was able to paint a rough picture of this storyline based on my use of familiar fantasy and action movie tropes. The young warrior outshining the old king? We've been telling that story since Beowulf and long before. And just like I know that you know that trope, I know that Greg knows it. I don't think I'm fooling any one of my players with my fancy ideas. I want them to feel familiar with the direction we're heading so that when it shifts, we aren't too far from the main road. And that shift could happen from my writing choices, their role-playing choices, or any of our many multicolored or multi-pixeled dice. So, when our metagame knowledge and the actual game world collide, we have this section here. When you are seeing your game on these terms, you and your players can start experiencing the game in this, dare I say, heightened experience. And that's not to say the others are bad. It's fine to play the game for the game's sake and not really pay attention to rules like downtime or be aware of your fantasy tropes. And it's fine to get caught up in the fun of a well-structured narrative and world building or just optimize your character builds on forums. But if you want an elevated gaming experience, which you probably do because you're seeking out RPG advice videos and you've decided that my voice is worth your time, thanks. You should start being aware of how your in-game choices and metagame choices are playing off one another. But this isn't true Truesight yet. I'm going to add one more circle and get back to the third and final act of our little story time. Greg isn't just a great player, he's a really good guy. Ton stepping up to say just the right thing the group needs, even if it's a little stern, is something that the character shares with his player. We were playing out this game during the pandemic, and the players were all supporting each other from our mutually isolated Zoom screens and Roll20 maps. Greg would frequently make us laugh, call me out on a rules clarification, or make the call when it was time to shift from makeshift group therapy to real D&D time. I didn't find out until about 30 sessions into our 47-session game that Greg had been ordering unpainted minis from our game store. Specifically, one monster or NPC from every session. When he showed a picture of his rad orc riding on a direwolf, I was excited to include a brief encounter where the crew could fight and win the favor of an otherworldly direwolf so that Ton could have a battle beast just like the one mini he painted that wasn't game canon yet. But Greg was going through something less fun, something rough on his own. He only brought it up once and gave signals that it wasn't something he wanted to talk about. But it didn't affect how he played Ton. It didn't affect how he was a bastion for the group in-game and out of game. So the Fulcrum treks out to what could be their final dungeon. Trials are completed, puzzles are solved, minions are smote. You know how these things go. Get to the part where the player party and the rival party are racing to the final MacGuffin. When things are most dire for the rival party, my NPCs, unaware that they're villains of this story, Ranunculus seizes his moment. An old gladiator no more, Ranunculus turns smiling, spinning his meteor hammer until it builds a destructive momentum. He is ready to take on the whole of the Fulcrum to buy his new friends time to complete their mission. He may die. No, he most certainly will die. But win or lose, the victors will remember his bold last stand. He calls out to the hopeful pupil that stumbled into his gym months ago. "Hey, Ton, it's the end of the line. We're two big fellas. That dungeon hallway really ain't big enough for both of us." Ton is hurt. He's on his knees and struggling to breathe through spurts of blood. "What did you expect, Ton?" he gurgles to himself. "Killing a dragon god is hard work, and there's always another minion." The Fulcrum have already seen him die once on this long journey, and Vith, the cleric, is running low on miracles today. They can see how tough Ranunculus is, and after all they've been through, they aren't certain that Ton can take him. They lash out before Ranunculus can say any more tough guy speeches. Eldritch blasts, wild-shaped claws, slowing spells, longsword strikes, and sacred flames all graze off the Goliath's spiked armor, or connect with so little damage against this beast of a man. Ranunculus chuckles as he hurls javelins, each new spike in the floor emanating a rope of force, giving Ranunculus a more favorable battlefield. This is all a sport to him. Just one last fight in an arena of his choosing. Ranunculus is ready to land a finishing blow on the little tiefling that had scratched him up with those eldritch blasts. Oh well, she chose this fight too, and she can face the consequences. Suddenly, it is not the delicate tiefling on the ground before him. It is a fully armored and angry half-orc with a shield and flail. Ton! Their matching cloaks had manifested a body swap spell. Handy. Ton had told his friends that he wanted his fight alone, but he could admit when he needed help. They brought him enough time to use the last of his lay on hands to get all of the important pieces back in order. Not up to full, but enough to take on one last sworn foe for the day. "Didn't I say this fight was mine?" he barks back at his friends. If he were the winking type, there would be a wink. But not Ton. It's time for business. Ranunculus tears off his helm so he can see his most glorious foe. Maybe he's strong enough to give him a good death and tell his tale. This fight, his training, his legacy would live on. You've bulked up, kid. Ready to finish this man-to-man? We're in initiative order. Ton's turn is up. Greg's turn is up. And as I leave Ranunculus with a ready-to-attack action, I realize something. Greg's dad is in the hospital. He didn't want to talk about it because he seemed to know that that story wasn't going to have a happy ending. And here I have placed the closest thing Ton has to a father figure in front of him for Greg to fight. The classic Spartan, Viking, samurai, glorious death storyline was so well thought out. Everything moved into place perfectly. Greg was practically on cue. We were making jazz together. But how could I have gotten this situation so wrong? That is, I got it wrong until... No, says Ton. No, says Greg. I am stunned. Ranunculus is stunned. I'm not sure if all the other players and their characters are stunned, but up until now, Ton, the Vengeance Paladin, has personally been the one to advocate for righteous killing. But now... It doesn't have to end this way, Ranunculus. Don't go out just because you can. You've got more to live for. You've got plenty of fight in you. I'll go with you. Let's find a few more dangerous, uncharted places in this big, messed up world, and we'll conquer them together. I don't know if Greg's dad had already passed when the final showdown with Ranunculus happened, but I know that the predicament Greg faced in real life suddenly made our D&D interaction much more important. I'm glad we got it right. I'm glad I didn't stick to my scripted adventure and tropes. I'm glad Greg used his character, the game, and the world we built together to make something meaningful for everyone at our virtual table. Real life is an undeniable factor of your tabletop role-playing game. Real people are a factor. Even if you are playing in a solo game, you should know where you are and if the game is an effective outlet for you. We have to combat work schedules tougher than any dragon. We have to combat the feelings of our bad day in order to let loose and have a good time. We have to spend money on a few new books or spend some time homebrewing. We might have to have a talk when someone is repeatedly drinking too much at the table. We might have to have a talk about one child using the game to be a bully to another child. We definitely have to figure out who's bringing the snacks. Anytime we sit down to play a tabletop role-playing game, we have three intersecting planes: the game, the metagame, and real life. When you recognize the parts of yourself that match the character you made, you're here. When you find the perfect synergy between an optimized build and how you actually want to play the game, you're over here. When you're enjoying rolling dice and telling jokes with a group of people you can call friends and you don't care about the rules, you're over here. And when you can create a safe gaming space where you talk to your players, remember the rules, but remember when to break them, and have fun while telling amazing stories that don't have to be published to be real, you're right here. Now you have Truesight. Go seize your next magical moment.